Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today we have a very special guest rejoining us. He's been one of our favorite guests. Many would argue, especially him, would argue that he is our all-time favorite guest, and he's been featured multiple times through the first 3 seasons. So I'm happy to welcome back Dr. Scott Stevens, Ducks Unlimited Canada's Director of Regional Operations for the Prairies and Boreal. Scott, welcome back.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Mike. Although I would say, I think maybe I'm really just the guy who's not afraid to answer your call now that they know what you're looking for when you reach out to them.
Yeah, I was kind of suspicious that was starting to happen. Anytime people see me trying to get in touch with them, they think, uh-oh, here comes the request for another podcast appearance. But hey, that's okay. I appreciate you actually responding and being a willing participant. So thank you for that.
You bet.
We wanted to have you back on here before we close out season 3 to talk about sort of an update on how habitat conditions, wetland conditions there on the prairies are shaping up. We're actually recording this episode in getting close to mid-January, January 11th. And we're going to hear a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of how soil moisture and snow accumulation and all of that type of stuff is shaping up, because those things become important determinants for how the wetland conditions actually turn out as the ducks return back in the spring. But for starters, I just wanted to chat with you a bit about what you've been up to since we last spoke in November and since the season up there has closed. What's a person do once the duck season, waterfowl season closes in Canada? Yeah,
good question. So yeah, I think the last time we were supposed to talk, I missed the call because I happened to be out in a duck blind, but that was kind of it. So yeah, since then, I procured some venison, so that was on the list. And then I entertain myself and make sure I get a little physical activity in the wintertime by trapping marten out in some spruce forest that's north of here. So that keeps me out of the pool hall, I guess.
Now, is your venison of the whitetail variety, or are we talking mule deer up there?
Yeah, whitetail. I have a farm that's like a 5-minute drive from my house here, so it's definitely convenient. And I was able to harvest a nice mature doe and a nice, at least what they call around here is a nice freezer buck. So
what does that mean? The ones that's big enough to put meat in the freezer, but not big enough to hang on the wall?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have not seen many that reached the trophy class, but this one had, the feature that I'm always looking for, which is a nice long tenderloin. So it fit the bill.
Okay. All right. How far west do you have to go before you get into mule deer, black-tailed deer?
You can actually see some in the western part of Manitoba, but interestingly enough, it is illegal to shoot a mule deer in Manitoba. So you're only allowed to shoot whitetails. But yes, Saskatchewan has healthy mule deer populations and has some spectacular trophy mule deer over there. So, but we don't get those.
Okay. Well, what else have you been up to? I know from following you on social media, you've had another round of decoy projects. So any interesting updates on those?
Yeah. So maybe the last decoy project, sort of still in the pandemic, has been, I got plywood over the holidays and cut out a bunch of crane silhouettes. And really my goal was, I purchased some crane silhouettes, but they're all adult birds. So these that I made are focused on being juvenile cranes. And I also focused on having these birds painted to have a little more of the rusty color that they take on, just to add a little diversity to the spread, I guess.
That's going to be the difference maker, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
I had a bit of fun with you on social media about your the pattern that you laid out there in that plywood. I was curious.
Yes, you did. You pointed out that I could have gotten one more if I'd been more efficient. So yeah, out of each sheet of plywood, out of the first 2, I got 11 crane silhouettes, but on the last one, I got 12. So, at least I made some improvement.
Yeah. So I haven't really figured out exactly how we want to go about that. If those 2 extra, we could call them, maybe I should stop Ulu as Ulu is getting upset that I'm getting on your case. Apparently.
Yeah, I don't know what she thinks she's doing. She's guarding something, but
Okay. Yeah. So I haven't figured out if we need to consider those 2 additional sandhill cranes as extra, and therefore they kind of count towards my share of the spread, or if we just need to treat them as part of the story where you failed to get the most out of your plywood. I'm not sure which is the more appropriate way to view that.
Yeah, me either. I don't think they're extra because they didn't get made. They never existed. So.
All right. Well, okay. Any other decoy projects that at this point or on the horizon?
No, the last step I have with the crane decoys is I had to figure out kind of a system for the stakes. And so that took a little work for a guy like me of average intelligence or below. But I think I figured out a workable solution there. So yeah, I've just been waiting on my local hardware store to restock some of the plumbing supplies that I needed for my stake attachment. And then I'll be back to finishing off the cranes.
Okay. Well, let's transition to some, some topics that are more in line with our conservation and habitat work. And I guess I just wanted to get an update on how things are working there for Ducks Unlimited Canada. I suspect that y'all are kind of all still working remotely, but otherwise, you're still rocking along and everything is good with DU Canada still doing all the important habitat work and getting out in the field. Although I don't know how much out in the field you do in Canada this time of year. What's it like up there as a DU Canada employee when you're locked in the winter?
Well, yeah, and I should preface my comments by saying I'm not really out in the field in the summer.
Okay.
So, but yeah, now is the time of year when our field staff who are out in the field during the summer. They're doing other stuff. They are still doing outreach to landowners and that kind of thing. They'll send some letters or may have phone conversations this time of the year. But yeah, they're also working on, there's a constant cycle of grant proposals and there's some of those that are moving along. And yeah, in general, we're doing well. Our staff have adapted well to operating under this new constraints that all of us have had to figure out, and they've done so pretty successfully. I'll admit we've been very proud of the way our staff have adapted, and we're going to exceed our conservation goals this year. Ironically enough, we've seen lots of success with fundraising, mostly from foundations this year. So we've got solid funding moving along, and our field staff are still able to deliver the habitat work out on the ground that they're focused on. So yeah, things are pretty good.
Scott, whenever I first asked you that question about what's a DU Canada employee do during this time of year, I was thinking, because everything is all locked up, there's not a whole lot of field work that you can do. But I actually do think in some cases it's the winter months, depending on what kind of project it is. It's the winter months when the ground gets all frozen that you actually do some of that work. Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, there are some projects that can only be done in the winter. Especially some of our big marsh rebuilds or fixing the infrastructure associated with some of those. I don't think we have any of those big projects going on this year, but yeah, some of them we require kind of deep frost before we can get going on, and they work out there in conditions that can be 20 below zero. So yeah, there are times when this is the prime time for our stuff to get things done, but I don't think we have any of those projects ongoing this year.
Scott, let's talk now about the thing that we're all going to be looking forward to here in the next couple of months, which is how the wetland conditions are shaping up as these birds return, north. We're obviously several months away from that, and as we've talked in the past, it's really never too early to start looking at wetland conditions to see how things might shape up at some point in the future. It's not as though we get an annual reset with the wetland conditions. The conditions that wetlands are in right now will influence what they're like in 6 months in some way or another. There obviously can be things that come along during that time that make a big difference. But if we go back, let's go back to the fall of last year, because that's perhaps one of the most relevant times to start thinking about how things are going to shape up for this spring. So, tell us, and I know you and I have talked about this before, as I said, but just kind of briefly Going back to the fall, what's the most important determinant that we start to look at in terms of how things might shape up? Or one of the first things that needs to be in place to increase the chance of us having good wetland conditions once the spring rolls around?
Yeah, you're right, Mike. Really, the condition that they went into fall, is relevant. And I would say, by and large, across the Canadian prairies, we weren't in great shape. We had undergone some drying, and, even last spring, we didn't have spectacular wetland conditions. Things were pretty dry in a bunch of areas. So that definitely plays a role. And then, the other important factor in the other time period that we do kind of pay attention as we get close to freeze up. And the ideal conditions would be that we have some fall rains and that the soil is really saturated when it freezes. We talk about frost seal. So if you have those kind of conditions, you have good frost seal where, the ground is saturated and frozen. And when we get to spring melt, when things start to thaw, as the snow melts, that will melt typically before the soil thaws out, and everything that's on top of that frozen soil will run into wetlands and, help improve wetland conditions. This fall, once again, we were still pretty dry. So I would say soil moisture conditions were not great. We did not have soaking fall rains. So, that puts us in a position of, even if we had significant snowpack, the question would be around how much of that moisture in that snow would actually run off and positively impact wetland conditions.
Yeah, Scott, I know that, we're here mid-January. There's only a couple of weeks left in the duck season here, really across the U.S. And it's been a struggle for a lot of hunters. There have been, it hasn't been very cold to begin with to really bring a lot of the birds down. There hasn't been a lot of snow at the northern latitudes. But then also kind of compounding that is going to be the fact that I don't think there was a great deal of, we didn't have we don't expect there to have been above average production last year outside of the Dakotas. We all know that the Dakotas were really wet, and certainly on the teal and some of the species that nested there, they had tremendous production. But once you get into Canada, things were fairly dry throughout much of last summer. So that's something that I think may have been overlooked by some of us, given how well things were in the Dakotas and how much production occurred there. People kind of overlooked the fact that we had some dry conditions, really dry conditions in the prairies of Canada that hurt production there. And then those dry conditions, as you talked about, have kind of stuck with us there through the fall. So it sounds like we don't have great soil moisture conditions. So that's kind of one ingredient that's working against us already. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we didn't come out of the summer and into the fall with robust wetland conditions either. So a couple of things working against us already there. The other ingredient that we kind of look for would be what happens during the winter in terms of snow that would subsequently run off in the spring. What can you tell us about the amount of snow that's on the prairie landscape?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't have great news on that front either. So we kind of have the trifecta setting up against us. We didn't have great conditions in the summer. In the fall, we didn't get those rains. And now in the winter, early in the winter, we don't have much snow across the prairies of Canada. And I actually looked. It doesn't look like we have a lot of snow across the Dakotas either. So not great snowpack. Now, I would say, mid-January, there's a lot of winter left, especially when you live kind of where I do. I think the snowiest months are kind of March and even into April. So, there's still time that we could get that snow. But as we discussed, kind of those other conditions are not set up well where even if we had a bunch of snow, it's likely to dramatically change the wetland conditions that we had last year. In fact, at this point, I would probably say we're going to dry further, and things are probably going to be tougher out there on the landscape at least for conditions that are conducive to birds reproducing well.
I talked a minute ago about how good the Dakotas were in terms of wetland conditions and duck production. But I think I've seen some maps. You shared some maps with me that indicate even a good chunk of North Dakota and maybe even into South Dakota. I'm not actually sure how far south it goes, but they are starting to develop some mild drought conditions of their own. And so that's not a good thing. I'm not sure how you've fared in terms of temperature in the Canadian prairies, but do those warmer than average winters contribute further to a loss of moisture from those wetlands?
They definitely can. And we also have been warmer than normal. I would say, normal temperatures, especially during January, we would be on the Fahrenheit scale, we would usually be well below 0 Fahrenheit. So, minus 10, could even be minus 20. We've not seen that. Like right now, today, I suspect we're probably 20 degrees. So what you can have happen, which doesn't help with maintaining moisture and snow and allowing that to run off, is, we can have a few days where we get up above freezing, and you have some of that snow that either melts or sort of evaporates into the atmosphere. And we've probably had those conditions recently, because when you get that, you see fog everywhere. And the other thing we can see is hoarfrost, where all the trees are covered with frost. And that's driven by those high humidity conditions or high moisture conditions. And some of the snow evaporating with those warmer temperatures actually contributes to that. So we have seen some of those conditions. So yeah, I think, we've been drier than normal. We've been warmer than normal. And those are all challenging things if you're trying to stack up a big snowpack that's going to run into wetlands.
So I guess the takeaway is that as we look forward to the spring, we probably ought to manage our expectations certainly this year, because it's not shaping up right now to be the best. But like you said, there are still quite a few months between now and when the ducks will settle on the landscape. But right now, it's probably appropriate to have a bit of a tepid expectation of what we're going to find up there. Would you say that would be wise?
Yeah, I think that's true. And the other point that I would add is, even in places like South Dakota, we started out talking about how current wetland conditions kind of carry over across years, and that's definitely true. But we know that the best years for duck production kind of happen when we have those smallest and shallowest wetlands on the landscape, when those have been dry and are kind of filling up with water for the first time. So, the fact that places like South Dakota may have some carryover water in semi-permanent wetlands and permanent wetlands is good. It's better than everything being totally dry, but it's not as good as if you have, a big snowpack running into those shallow wetlands and filling those up, kind of like they had last spring going on. So, the dry conditions, I would say, the pond count that we typically get when we have the May breeding survey doesn't tell the whole story, because the type of ponds that are wet really play an important role also.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good point. Well, we will check back with you. Like I said, we're going to be coming to a close here on season 3 pretty soon, and then we'll start something back up again in the summer. And as soon as we do, I know some of the very first episodes that we'll want to that we'll have will be related to how the wetland conditions actually did materialize and develop into the spring and early summer. So we'll be sure to catch up with you then. I did want to end though with a quick question about any. I know we talked before in November. You said all the ducks had gone except for maybe some of the birds that were still hanging out on some bodies of water that had not yet to freeze. Any Canada geese hang around up there in Winnipeg or on the prairies this time of year, or is everything locked up and all birds are gone?
Well, I would say everything's pretty much locked up. There could be some city geese, I would call them. In the city, but it has been, I can't remember the last time I saw a Canada goose or any other waterfowl. It's been over a month. So, there could be some holdouts somewhere, but not in any numbers at all.
I was just kind of curious about that. I know that I've seen reports of still some Canada geese still hanging out in North Dakota. I don't know how many, but they're isolated to the some of those larger bodies of water, is my understanding. But if you don't have a lot of snow on the ground and they've got a lot of harvested fields that they can go exploit, that'll happen. They'll hang out there. So I just wasn't sure if any of that was still occurring up in Winnipeg. I fully expected all the ducks to be gone. Certainly you're not having to beat off the gadwalls up there right now. So, they have long gotten out of there. But anyway, yeah, just wanted to check on that.
That's
Anything
right.
else that you want to share with us, Scott, before we wrap this one up?
No, I can't think of anything. Yeah, we'll see what the rest of the winter brings. And, I guess maybe the only thing I'd add is we're all hopeful that, that come May, we will be able to get that important information through the May breeding survey, on duck numbers and pond numbers and those kind of things. Last year was kind of unprecedented. We were without that. So, not a big deal to be without it for a year, but I know we'd sure all like to get back going on having that data again. So hopefully that can be possible come May.
Yeah, that's a good point, Scott. I hadn't really thought about that, but I'll have an opportunity here in the coming weeks to speak with someone about that. Maybe they'll have some insight to share on whether the planning is underway to try to conduct that survey, get that survey conducted this year. Obviously, we're still going to be dealing with some COVID travel restrictions, but it'll be interesting to see where things stand in that regard, because you're right. 1 year of data, missing data is, it doesn't cause too much pain, but when you start looking at 2 years of missing data, then you kind of start to wonder, but actually what's going on with the population and habitat conditions there. But well, Scott, that's going to wrap it up for us here. We appreciate your time. Appreciate you joining us here on short notice, and look forward to catching up with you again in a few months.
Yes, always a pleasure to be with you and be part of the podcast. So happy to do it anytime.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Scott Stevens with Ducks Unlimited Canada, one of our all-time favorite guests. We appreciate him joining us and being very accommodating with his time and generous with his time. As always, a special thanks to Clay Baird for the great work he does on this podcast and getting these out to you. And of course, to you, our listener, we thank you for joining us, spending your time with us, and for your support of wetlands waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.